at this time we conceived the character of Marmeladov. And if one tries to put Dostoevsky in a broader 19th century literary context, in particular in terms of the Western influences on him, then there are probably two main ones. On the one hand, it's Balzac, the French author, and a lot of the philosophical ideas and some ideas of crime are coming from there. And the other author, of course, would be Dickens, and a lot of the sentimentality that you see in Dostoevsky's work is probably very similar to that you would see in Charles Dickens' some novels. And those are, and both of those figures, of course, are some major, greats of world literature. But then both of them have elements of more popular type of, entertainment as well. What somebody called the penny dreadful. And one of the things that Dostoevsky has been criticized for by some critics and some authors is that he does indeed use some rather sort of cheap techniques, those of the bad Gothic novel. Obviously, when these books have been published, they've been published in serial publications in journals, so you want to encourage the reader to buy the next copy of the journal when it comes out a month or a year later. So you always want to leave something on a cliffhanger, essentially. So it's the same sort of thing that you get in some TV shows and whatnot. But sometimes there may be some cheap effects, some cheap throws or cheap shocks within the text in order to build on this thing. So you have this huge contrast. On the one hand, he's using literary techniques of some of the cheapest type of detective and mystery novels. On the other hand, these are the big metaphysical novels, debates of all of world literature. You may also know that the actual writing of Crime and Punishment or events around it were particularly fraught for Dostoevsky. Because in 1864 his brother had died, and Dostoevsky rather generously assumed all of his brother's debts. He didn't have to do that, and accepted various contracts for producing works. And essentially, he signed a contract which said if he didn't produce some work within a particular time period, then he would lose the royalties to all of his works for 20 years, 10 or 20 years to come. So essentially, he was in very serious financial straits, and it was almost impossible for him to write this work. He had no time to do it, and he was spending all of his time gambling away in Germany. But then he decided, okay, I will write something really quickly, and for that I'll hire a stenographer. His first wife had just died as well, so he was some grief-stricken with that. But it was one of those fortunate moments in his life when the secretary he hired to type out his work very quickly was the person, Anna Snitkin, who became his second wife. So that's one of the significant details of Dostoevsky's biography. So he was able to write this work from down very quickly and then buy back the rights to his future publications, so obviously saved himself a lot of money that way, and then started working on Crime and Punishment. Dostoevsky's novels, I think I've said this before, but they all operate on various levels of interpretation. The first one is a very concrete and realistic novel. You can just read them for what they are, and then of course that is primarily crime novels, as we said before. They can all be called Crime and Punishment. You can just read them for entertainment. You don't have to go to any interpretive level beyond that if you don't want to. That's one way of looking at them. Then you can also focus, of course, on the social element in particular, the way in which the social novels critique of the time. It's based on Dostoevsky's interpretation of the society, and that goes beyond again, analysis of economic and some social circumstances. Ultimately, this is Dostoevsky saying that there are certain key currents, ideological currents of the time. There's a struggle going on in Russia between these forces, whether we think of them as Western and Russian, Western and Slavophile, rationalist, or more mystical, more religious. But essentially, it's the combination of the obviously social and these bigger intellectual ideas. Dostoevsky will often build from very concrete events of the day. He was always reading the newspapers, taking examples from the newspapers to illustrate his major themes. And of course, he was even more happy, as I said before, when something that he had imagined in his work then actually became a real-life event. So, for example, a student who was rather short of money did decide to rob a pawnbroker. After all, I didn't he murdered her on that occasion, but there was that robbery. So Dostoevsky liked it when the social dimension of his text actually reinforced or validated by life itself. Yesterday can be read as detective stories, as we said. For those of you who've got to Porfiry Petrovich in this text already, does he remind you of anyone in terms of detectives? Somebody go as far as Porfiry? I mean, all sorts of detectives have certain things in common, whether Hercule Poirot or Sherlock Holmes and so on. But is there any one detective that you think is rather like Porfiry Petrovich? Yeah?
When he
Okay, yes, so going all the way back to Hugo. Yes, so I think that probably in terms of influence on some Dostoevsky, may indeed come from Hugo, but then someone who might have been directly influenced by the portrayal of Porfiry Petrovich, a more modern. Perhaps you don't watch this program now, before your time. What's the sort of thing if Porfiry Petrovich say to, he'd say to Raskolnikov, and again, perhaps you haven't got that, so that's why you don't know. But okay, everything's fine. Then he'd say, oh yeah, there's one other thing, just one more thing, sir. Who says that? You probably don't watch it. Have you heard of Columbo?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
It's my dad's favorite show.
Okay, good. That was right, because Columbo's great, particularly earlier Columbo, when Peter Falk came back, that wasn't quite so good. But yeah, so what Columbo does is precisely what Porfiry Petrovich does, because Porfiry Petrovich knows pretty much immediately, through his great intellect and skill and intuition and so on, who the murderer is. And in the better episode of Columbo, actually Columbo is often quite sympathetic towards the murderer. I mean, we know who the murderer is in Columbo's episode. There was one episode, a really bad one, where you didn't know who the murderer was, I think, but in general, you did, of course. And the whole point is that he actually wants the murderer to come to an awareness that what they've done is in fact wrong, and there is this intellectual struggle between them. But we don't actually know, the direct evidence that the people who thought up the whole sort of Columbo sort of concept were directly influenced by Porfiry Petrovich. But I think the links are so close when you actually look at the way that they work, that there's interesting sort of parallels. So next time you watch a Columbo, if you ever do, you can think of Porfiry Petrovich. Okay, so there's this element of the thriller, psychological thriller within the text. First of all, if the crime hasn't taken place, will the person commit the crime, or who will commit the crime? Of course, in another of the great texts that is actually a mystery in Brothers Karamazov, we don't know at first who committed the murder. And of course, there are all different ways of having murder stories. With murder stories, sometimes you know the murderer from the beginning. Sometimes you think there might be one murderer, but in fact there are lots of murderers, something like Murder on the Orient Express. Sometimes the murderer, it's a real trick. The person who's investigating the crime is actually the murderer, like in Inspector Calls, or the person who's... Well, I don't want to give away too many murder mysteries because I sponsor, but anyway, there were like 6 or 7 sort of different basic things of work out who the murderer could be. Sometimes the victim himself or herself is the murderer, etc. It can get quite convoluted. Dostoevsky doesn't go quite that far, but there are different ways he puts his murder mysteries within his text. The question then is, will the murderer get caught? Will he get convicted? Why did he do it? Which of course will be the central issue of Crime and Punishment. And what will the outcome be? What are the psychological and moral consequences of the murder, not just for the murderer, but for all of those people around him as well? So another way of putting that is to ask what are the different stages of the punishment that we see described in the title of this text? And can you think about that? What are some of the ways in which perhaps Raskolnikov gets punished in this text, and in what sense is his punishment present in this text? Are there elements of punishment perhaps even before the crime is committed, for example? And if so, what would they be? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So like he punishes himself, kind of like thinking like, oh, why am I thinking these sort of thoughts like that? So it's like kind of like more self-inflicted. It's like, why am I even thinking about this? I shouldn't be.
So there's a lot of some mental torment and mental punishment, as you say earlier on, even before he commits the crime, if he commits the crime. Yeah. Okay. Good. Mm-hmm. Someone else? I'm going to say the same thing. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah. And I think another part of it is that in those early stages, and perhaps as a consequence of this, he has become so isolated from society. And in the first part of the book, at least, we're told he actually doesn't mind that's the position he has to be in order to commit this crime. But Dostoevsky himself, in describing the basic idea of Crime and Punishment, said that one of the reasons why Raskolnikov then seems to almost seek out an excuse to confess himself, that he feels the need to unburden his conscience ultimately in the various encounters with Porfiry and Sonia and others, is that he has felt himself completely cut off from humankind, that once he has committed this crime, this is indeed the transgression, he's stepped over a boundary, and he can no longer enter back into the human family. And one of the things the whole text is about is whether, in fact, it is possible, after having committed this crime, can he again join with his fellow human beings. And so that isolation, I think, is a punishment certainly after the murder, but in some ways he's also punishing himself before the murder as well. Okay, so the other element, one other of the elements, of course, is that this is a psychological novel. What is the humans of motivation? And I think there's probably, again, we should make a distinction in this novel between what are the motives of the crime. I know a lot of you are interested in that. Indeed, it is probably center stage in the text, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But also the causes. The causes might not necessarily be the same as the motivations. The motivations are those things that perhaps Raskolnikov will bring forward to explain to himself what has happened. It's also the motivations that maybe the prosecution would bring in if he came to court, etc. Those two things might not exactly coincide, and each party might only be telling the partial truth for whatever reasons about those things. We too, of course, as readers, are actually trying to work out what the motivation of the crime is. Are there many reasons why he committed the crime, and which are the most important ones? Because I think when we look at it, it's one way of looking at it is it's a sort of Russian doll, the Matryoshka, where the outer reason is given. Okay, well, what would be the most likely reason for committing this crime? When a lesser investigator than Porfiry Petrovich would look at it, come to that crime scene, what would their initial feeling be? Why has this taken place? What would be the motive for this crime? They come upon the scene of the slaughtered pawnbroker. What is the obvious conclusion they draw from that scene? Yeah.
That she was murdered for her money.
Yeah, so the motive is pretty basic, like a lot of murder motives would be robbery. But of course, Porfiry realizes pretty early on that there's something odd about all of this. What's one of the main things that sort of arouses suspicions, like Columbo's suspicions get aroused? Why does Porfiry immediately think, okay, this is not a simple act of robbery?
Not much was taken from her inventory?
Yeah, not much was sort of taken, or the person did a really bad job of thinking that, okay, they rummaged through certain trunks, but then there's like a big box there, say, with money signs on it or whatever, and they just didn't take that at all. So quite clearly, if robbery was the motive, okay, they could have panicked. And the more he puts the picture together, the more psychologically it doesn't feel that it's simply about sort of robbery. So we get this outer sort of motivation that's to do with sort of robbery. And then we go to other things more specifically connected with Raskolnikov, and what are some of the motivations that are actually sort of suggested, perhaps even before you've got to the murder, or certainly before you've got to the deeper analysis of his motives? What are some of the other reasons that he might have done this crime? I mean, we do know that there's this bigger thing of the Superman idea, and we'll come to that a bit later, but what are some of the other reasons why he might have committed the crime that you get hinted at in the early sections of the book? Yeah?
Class struggle.
So you can say
Class struggle.
So class struggle, so that we can sort of see her as representative of certain evil, unfair forces in this unjust capitalist society, and that Raskolnikov, if he's some type of revolutionary figure, is trying to put those things right. So that is the more utilitarian sort of reading of it. So, and all of these things, of course, do have overlap. So when he's saying, he's been a great man, that would be he's doing the great man thing, not for his own sort of future advancement, but it's to help sort of mankind essentially. So 100 good deeds for this one crime. We're sort of told that if he kills the pawnbroker, takes some money, then uses it in a good way, society as a whole sort of benefits. So this is all part of this broader question of whether utilitarian morality, utilitarian ethics, is the only thing that really makes sense. That it's the greatest good of the greatest number. These ideas coming from Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, etc., etc. They talk about this political economy coming from England at an early stage in the text, and these are ideas that Dostoevsky has already critiqued in Notes from Underground. Okay, good. So there is that sort of social element to the crime. What else? Is Raskolnikov just doing it because he's, he wants to have a better apartment, he wants to buy some nice things, or he doesn't want to study, or all of these things? What are some other motivations for him?
To support his family, since like his sister and mother have been sending him money, and he feels like kind of ashamed that he can't do anything for himself.
Okay, yes, so support the family. The family is making sacrifices for him, and he wants to give back. And in fact, it's even darker than that, isn't it? He thinks that Dunya is about to marry this really awful, low-life Luzhin, even though Luzhin thinks of himself as this absolutely wonderful human being, in order, because Raskolnikov is the heart of the family. He, all of the family's hopes are pinned on him, and he sees this essentially as not that different from Sonia selling herself into prostitution, that this type of marriage would be just like a legalized prostitution. So he feels that sort of guilt. He feels the guilt that he hasn't fulfilled the family's of hopes in him, essentially, and wants to pay them back, but also wants to avoid Dunya having what he sees as a fate worse than death, with Zaprusian. Of course, Svidrigaïlov's in the background as well, with all of these things taking place there. Okay, good. So all of these things are there, and then of course it does move on to this bigger issue of does he want to be a Superman? Does he believe that he is an exceptional human being? And if so, then he's entitled to do things which ignore normal human understandings of morality. Of course, one of the things that Raskolnikov actually puts very powerfully, I think, in the text is that it's almost a case of might is right. If he'd actually succeeded in his plan, then no one would be able to criticize him because he would be a Napoleonic figure, essentially. And if you are one of the accepted rulers of mankind, then you can do what you want, essentially. He sort of says that if you're sort of bombing some towns, if you commit a mass murder with an army, no one's going to criticize you for that because, in a sense, it's been accepted that you're the person who has the right to do those things. But there's something aesthetically displeasing about the sort of murder he's taking place. So we'll come to that phrase a bit later on. When he says that, all sorts of murders get committed and people turn a blind eye to them, but it's because of this particular individualistic murder that you're criticizing me. So that's a place where the idea of the Superman, someone who doesn't have to acknowledge conventional morality and just his idea that he is, he has major things he can offer to humankind, come together. But then probably the final element of this, and I'm not saying that these are just, you get into the true meaning of it, so the notion of the Russian doll, that you take away each one and you're getting closer to the truth, and it's only the final doll is the actual meaning. I think it's more the point that all of these things are combined. But the final reading perhaps would be that he simply does it just as a test, it just as a completely existential act to say, can I do this? What's stopping me from doing this particular thing? Am I completely free? So therefore, what would be the greatest statement of my freedom? Would be to kill someone for no reason at all. Essentially, all of these are given reasons for killing her, but perhaps I do this for no reason at all. Saying just because I can, and anyone can do these things. And this is obviously going into some very dark areas, but it's also very much a prefiguring of key existentialist themes about how you create your own sort of meaning in life. Are you completely free? And one of the then big paradoxes that arises, I think, in all of this is that on the one hand, Dostoevsky is certainly in his work always on the side of human freedom. The big critique at the heart of Notes from Underground is that the new rationalist, utilitarian, materialist theories on man claim essentially that all people think in the same way, more or less, that, and if that's the case, then most people should have the same values, and then you can decide what type of society would be appropriate for humans to live in, because no one's going to disagree essentially about what counts as someone's Russian, so wygoda, one's benefit, one's good, the thing that's most beneficial or useful to you. But what Dostoevsky's anti-hero in Notes from Underground claims is, well, why do I have to share the same values as everyone else? Perhaps I have a different view. Everyone else thinks that these things are pleasurable, but perhaps pain is what gives me pleasure. And in part, that this can be seen also in some sexual terms. There's elements of sadism and masochism and all of this. Someone like Marmeladov, of course, is an extreme example of this, that he's crying out, I'm actually getting pleasure, as Katerina Ivanovna's pulling him by the hair across the room, and it's not just the physical and sexual sort of arousal he might be getting from that, but actual type of humiliation, which in a strange way, confirms to him how low he's fallen, but he gets a perverted sort of pleasure out of that at some level. But essentially, Dostoevsky is claiming in Notes from Underground that we can't know what is a person's particular sort of good, their value, the thing that they want their life to be built around. So essentially, it's impossible to build society according to some agreed blueprint. So he's always asserting that the power of the human will, human freedom to do what you want, but at the same time, he wants to view these things within a Christian framework. And what he wants to do is to say that, yes, you have to be able to choose freely between good and evil. And if, as his Grand Inquisitor says, the only guide you have before you is the example of Christ, then for Dostoevsky, often human beings are too weak to make the right choices with simply the example of this is good, this is evil, what I'm going to choose. So in Brothers Karamazov, the Grand Inquisitor, this sort of quasi-political dictator figure, has corrected Christ's work and says that we're going to tell people what's good, we're going to tell people what's evil, because you didn't spell things out for them. You didn't prove through certain types of miracle that you knew the answers to everything, and man was left with the burden of free will. So this burden of free will is something that Dostoevsky is always struggling with. So we can say then that Raskolnikov perhaps has this freedom to do what he wants within the text, But the other side of the coin is that it's also possible that he's being directed at all points in the novel towards a particular outcome, not just by the novelist Dostoevsky himself, but by fate, and fate understood as predestination, or sort of God's plan for him. Because one of the ways of reading the text is precisely that everything has to happen as it does in order for Raskolnikov to be brought to his sort of final redemption. And if that's so, then the old pawnbroker becomes collateral damage in this sort of path, and it's almost as if this is also part of God's plan, that the pawnbroker should be killed by Raskolnikov in order that Raskolnikov should be saved, which again is a very strange way of looking at things, but there are those hints within the text that that could be what's happening. Now, that's a problematic and provocative notion I just throw out there for you. You can sort of think about it and argue about it. But if there are things in the text which seem to be coincidences, which later on Raskolnikov says, oh yes, my fate was decided at this point, well, who is doing that? Are these just coincidences, and he's still in control of his meanings, he tries to read them in a particular way, or is there some divine providence involved here as well? How are we to understand the notions of fate, coincidence, providence, etc. within this text? So the whole issue of sort of free will, determinism, predestination, and so on, I think are really at the heart of this novel. Okay, so Dostoevsky initially planned Crime and Punishment to be a first-person narrative, first-person confessional, which certainly would have changed things, but I think in many ways it worked out better this way. And one of the things that's at the heart of the Dostoevsky novel, I mentioned this term before, is the idea of polyphony. It's a polyphonic novel in which not only do you have different characters represented certain ideas, and these ideas are then set to argue out their strong and weak points one against the other, but essentially you don't really see the author coming down on one particular side, on the side of one character's worldviews. Now, again, that's a somewhat problematic notion. I think there are places in Dostoevsky's text where he does seem to want to push the argument in a particular direction. In particular, many people have a problem with the epilogue of Crime and Punishment, and we'll come to that later, whether they find it convincing, whether they feel they would be better off without the epilogue, and so on and so forth. But what we get within the text is not just the characters having arguments between themselves about ideologies, about what they value and so on, but within a character as well. And obviously this happens primarily in Raskolnikov with the split within himself, but it happens with some of the other characters too. Okay, so let's just try then, so we can actually get through some of the points to look at the text. So, yeah, any questions at the moment, or any comments, or anything I've said thus far that I'll clarify, you disagree with, or chimes in something you've talked about? Okay. Yeah. So it starts off in early July, so we're not given a particular year, but I think that if you read it carefully, it does seem to be pretty much set in real time. That this is the mid 1860s in St. Petersburg. And why do you think it starts off in exceptional heat? Why are we given that detail as one of the first things that is said in the text? Why is it exceptionally hot in Petersburg? And it was actually a very hot summer in 1866. So that's another accurate element of the text. But why does Dostoevsky start off with exceptional heat? I think in the Russian just says, I can't remember if it says Чрезвычайно жаркое лето or Чрезвычайно жаркое время. Can you remember which it is? Yeah, okay, yeah, probably should be. At an extremely hot time, yeah? So, yeah.
I was just going to say, like, usually when heat is mentioned, it, like, rises tensions and a lot more action comes to fruition versus if it's cold, it usually means a more isolated tone.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I think it's actually it's true, isn't it? Like the Spike Lee film when everything's going on in the summer, and yeah, we do know that in fact when the temperatures get really high in the summer, the crime levels do increase for all sorts of reasons. Yeah. Okay. Good. Anything else? Yeah.
I was gonna like make the connection to like hell and the devil, like that kind of like heat, like a more devious heat.
It could be. I mean, certainly the demonic is going to be so present in this. The struggle is between God and the devil throughout the Dostoevsky work. So I think that sense of, yeah, there is this very, very dangerous backdrop to it. And the fact that so Petersburg, although on the one hand it's supposed to be this very controlled city, the devil is always present in Petersburg in Russian literature. Okay, good. I think it's also the whole notion of feverishness, which probably comes into both what you said, the sense that he is suffering from some type of brain fever, which is often, the medicine at this time is not particularly good, but also Dostoevsky, when he wants to show that the medics have not understood what his characters are going through, they say, oh yes, this character had brain fever, essentially, so that's like, catch-all diagnosis that they give, that there's this high temperature in the brain or something like that, or feverishness. So I think the fact that tensions are high, but there's a feverish mind at the heart of this text, and it is Raskolnikov's. And then of course maybe it's all of Russia as well. All of Russia is living through this very tense time. Imagine if this is 1866, then there's just been an assassination attempt on the Tsar, and so on and so forth. Okay, so we said before that the two minds in the Russian, as if in, как будто ли какой неврешимости, as if in uncertainty, the translator decided to make this a bit more explicit about Raskolnikov being this split figure. Okay, so the bottom of the page is a new step, a new word. So he wants to give his sort of new word. One of our past grads was at a conference a couple of weeks ago, who's written on the St. Petersburg theme in Russian literature, contrast this idea of the new word with the whole idea of Peter the Great wanted to do something new in his construction of Petersburg, and there possibly is some connection here. And very often when you're the writer, also you're trying to create your new word in opposition to what Peter the Great of Petersburg represents. Petersburg is certainly a character within this text. And we certainly see more of the dark underbelly of Petersburg in this text than we would, say, in the prologue to Pushkin's Sobron's Horseman. So the focus here is on how dirty, how sort of dusty it is, the drunkenness, the prostitution. There were a lot of prostitutes in Petersburg, largely because when the city was being built, or even when it was being populated, it was single men who tended to go there, or they were taken away from their families to build the new city. So there weren't that many women in Petersburg. So as a result, a lot of prostitutes went to Petersburg, and then that continued, sort of down the decades. So so the fact that it's not just that Dostoevsky is making it more gruesome or so dark than it actually was. No, certainly it was a hotbed of prostitution. In contrast to the ugliness of the scene of Petersburg, which again is not what we expect from this most beautiful city, we get Raskolnikov described as being remarkably sort of good looking. So in that detail, at least, maybe there is something exceptional about him, and it seems so strange, therefore, that he looks he's so ragged and badly dressed and dirty and so on. One of the interesting things in thinking about the causes of the crime and why Raskolnikov gets to the place he does within the text is something that sort of Tolstoy said. Tolstoy didn't have many comments explicit on Dostoevsky's work, but one thing he did say, which I think is interesting, is that if you actually try to understand Raskolnikov's committing of the crime, you don't focus on the month before the crime, or even the day before, or the moment of the crime. You think of all of the small things that Raskolnikov did over a longer period, which took him to the place where already these other things were so possible. Okay, so the fact that maybe he decided, I'm not going to get up today, or I'm not going to go to lecture, or I'm not going to do this, or not to do that, I'm not going to clean my room. Again, it all sounds a bit sort of childish, and I don't want to sound like Jordan Peterson, heaven forbid, or something like that, but it's that type of thing. All these little things perhaps put Raskolnikov in a state of mind when then it was easier for him to take the next step and the next step and the next step. Okay, so and when Tolstoy talks about that, critics have focused on this idea of what's called prosaics, and by that prosaics means like the everyday values, the little things of life, which actually end up in the Tolstoyan worldview as being more important and actually sort of, make us what we are. So in some ways, Raskolnikov has sort of been in error when he hasn't done lots of little things, which actually then turned him into the sort of person he became. Now, at some other level, of course, his idea takes on a life of its own. It's almost as if he's got into a not even hallucination, but somehow he's hypnotized himself, because when he actually commits the murder, certainly the first murder of the pawnbroker, we're told everything's done some machinalna in Russian, like in a machine, mechanical method. It's almost as if he's been sort of wound up, and then suddenly, it all starts working mechanically. like a clock, like a mechanical toy, the axe comes down. But he's not really in control at that moment. Now, of course, the question might be, well, he did have freedom up to a certain point, but he didn't, at the moment of committing the crime, do anything other than just set in motion something that had already been pre-timed, essentially predetermined. Okay, so I think that's another element of the clash of the free will and the determinism that we see within the text. I mentioned, I think, at the end of class last time that although the introduction by Oliver Ready, I think, is quite good in many respects, I think he's a bit harsh on Raskolnikov in some places. He seems to put a lot of emphasis on this notion of Raskolnikov as a man-child. There's some childishness about him. I don't really think that that's what's going on there, but certainly Dostoevsky does refer here to a childish touchiness. He is quite easily takes offence. Okay, so we see this sort of contrast in his plans for the crime between precision. He's counted how many steps there are to the site of the crime, 730, whatever, and the little details of carelessness that, okay, why is he wearing such a conspicuous hat if this is his dry run, if this is his test for the actual crime to take place. And we're given this word, a sort of test there, bottom page 5, and there's various ways of understanding this. This is both the rehearsal for the murder. Later on, of course, there are other rehearsals for the murder. What would be another rehearsal for the murder that we get in part 1? And this is a sort of rehearsal for the practicalities of the murder, but what other rehearsal of the murder do we get in part 1? Well, yeah.
The dream?
Yeah, the dream, right there, yeah. So the dream, in a sense, is a more valid rehearsal for it, because his unconscious or his conscience, however you want to think of it, has decided, okay, before I just went there, and even then I was having these doubts about, will I really do this? I'm going there just in case, etc. So even in his thinking about it, you get in this split. He thinks he's going to do this, but he's not convinced, and then he'll have these doubts and he'll go back and forth, these vacillations. But when he has the dream, it's pretty clear that this is what it's going to be like in reality. So this is the rehearsal, and the way he responds to that, of course, again, goes in two different directions. We think that the dream has saved him. He thinks he's been saved by the dream, and then, of course, something happens to push him again in a different direction. Okay, good. So this whole notion of the test, then, as I say, is also relevant to the idea of what he did was simply to test himself, to use the famous phrase, am I a louse? Am I just this, insect, a trembling creature, or am I something more than that? Am I this Superman, or just a decent human being? Okay, so that is the test essentially as well. So there are different levels of the test taking place within the text. So on page 6, for example, when he says, okay, circumstances are propitious, there's not many people here, that's good, just in case. So he immediately qualifies what he's thinking. So he's still split. He's saying, okay, yeah, if I were to do it, this is good, but, just in case, I'm not. I mean, he still hasn't committed to it, so he's still thinking it through. So the question for us always is, was there any point in all of this when he was completely free to go in a different direction? And that is the big question that Dostoevsky's text supposes. Okay, so he's trying to undermine himself there. I said before, the woman, the old pawnbroker is described in pretty repulsive sort of terms, so that's encouraging us to think, well, maybe, the world wouldn't be, it wouldn't be such a great loss to the world if something were to happen to her, particularly if she's going to die soon anyway, which, of course, is one of the phrases that other people use when they have this discussion about her. We get this mention on page 7 of Lizavieta's work. So for the first time, we're told that it's not just about the pawnbroker when it comes to this apartment, it's of Lizavieta as well. And as I said before, one of the strange things is that we often forget about the fact that there's a double murder here, that it's not just the pawnbroker, it's Lizavieta as well. And she indeed is collateral damage because there's no reason at all why she deserves to die. And of course, it's quite possible there's a third murder, because we know that Lizavieta is always pregnant. So we also don't know, and obviously they did no autopsy, but maybe when Raskolnikov killed Lizavieta, he killed someone else as well. We don't know that, but that's also possible. And it's even, I think, in the introduction here, the blurb, it says, when he commits a random murder. Well, I suppose murder could be more than one murder, but I just think the way it's worded there, it almost suggests that, yeah, we think of the murder of Crime Punishment as the pawnbroker, but there were two murders, of course, which is important. But Raskolnikov seems to forget about that. Most of the people in the text seem to forget about that as well, and that is also worth thinking about. Okay, so the things that he's pawned with her, link him with the family, link him with that sort of guilt about the money he's taken from the family. It was his sister's ring that she had and his father's watch. And therefore, of course, the link of the father with the pawnbroker there is introduced that way. The fact that the pawnbroker is calling him as a father, you might have found that so strange in the text, but this is Russians very often use these family terms to address one another. But having said that, Dostoevsky could have chosen a different way to describe this, so it doesn't completely take away the very slight possibility in all of this is some sort of psychodrama going on in which his anger against the pawnbroker is not necessarily completely removed from his anger against his mother. Again, we don't want everyone in Russian literature to be possible patricides and matricides. That would be going a bit too far. But nonetheless, there is something about Raskolnikov's relationship to his family which is not completely irrelevant when you come to think about how he's thinking about the old pawnbroker as well. So he thinks that everything he's doing is vile, so it's the aesthetics as much as anything that really offend him at this moment. He almost feels that, okay, if I were a great man, I should be doing something different from this. I mean, Napoleon's first steps wouldn't have been evolving such a seedy pawnbroker, such a seedy sort of, dark staircase in this awful apartment block in Petersburg. I mean, everyone has to start somewhere, but I think he actually feels it's somehow inappropriate to him, and that's his pride and as well. Okay. When Alyona says, "Oh, what business might you have with my sister, my half-sister?" Maybe it's suggesting that people do visit her, and she's not a prostitute, but she does seem to very readily sleep with various men. But that's partly, I think, because it seems that she's not exactly a holy fool. From this Russian tradition, which we can talk about a bit more. But she is easily controlled. She's quite weak. She is susceptible to all sorts of pressures. And maybe some of these men come along and sort of offer her some nice some things, and then she sleeps with them, and then she gets pregnant, etc., etc. So it may be the suggestion here that Alyona thinks it's not strange for someone to ask about her half sister because men do visit for that purpose as well. We don't really know, but that could be a hint there. Okay, so Raskolnikov then goes to a sort of a dive. I mean, very often the sort of characters sort of go to these sort of drinking places within the text. I think that is quite important. But we'll talk about that later. Okay, so he never set foot in one before. I think it would be a stretch to say this is like Herman having his first drink of beer in Queen of Spades, but who knows? There may be some connection there. Okay, page 10, he's having a thirst for human company, so he's been isolated for so long, and now he wants to get back to human company. But the fact of killing the pawnbroker will, of course, destroy any chance of human company for him, and that's what Dostoevsky says is at the heart of his desire to confess in some ways. Well, that may be going too far. A lot of him doesn't want to confess within the text. He's fighting against that, but he still does certain things within the text which sort of show ultimately he does seem to want to get caught. Okay, and if he wants to get caught, that means he wants to confess as well. Okay, so the portrayal of Marmeladov, maybe there's some hint that Marmeladov is a future version of Raskolnikov. They seem to have certain things there, intelligence, but elements of madness as well, so shared between them. The name is a non-Russian name. I mean, so marmalade is like a sweet jelly. So again, it suggests something sort of saccharine, sentimental about some Marmeladov, indeed about the portrayal of him as well. Page 13, this reference to political economy in England. You can check up the footnote, but this is again part of the utilitarian ethic, which would actually suggest that it's okay for the pawnbroker to be killed because that's just economics. There'll be a type of trickle-down economics. If he gets killed, there'll be financial benefit if Raskolnikov uses the money wisely. So why doesn't it make some sense, essentially? And I think in one of the notes it's pointed out that one of the words for a pawnbroker in Russian uses the word, she's like a percent woman. So the fact that because she takes a certain percentage on all of the pledges, of course, then it's also part of, okay, is this good math, essentially, that you kill this one person, 100 good deeds as a result of it. So all of those things are connected here. Marmeladov uses all references to the Bible, particularly to the New Testament, to talk about his sort of sufferance. Of course, in some ways it's ridiculous. He's very far from being a Christ figure. But on the other hand, he does genuinely sort of suffer, so presumably we should have empathy towards him in that way. But it's more likely to be hinting that Raskolnikov will have despite again the apparent blasphemous nature of this comparison, that there might be something Christ-like about Raskolnikov's suffering as well within the text. Again, that's probably going too far. Okay, so we're told that he's married to Katerina Ivanovna. Dostoevsky seems to like this name. Another of the heroines in his work in Crime and Punishment, as in Brothers Karamazov, has the same name, and she too is a somewhat hysterical figure. So Marmeladov married her out of pity for her plight, but could never make her happy, and therefore she's always comparing him to her future husband, her past husband, even though that past husband used to beat her up, etc. And Marmeladov accepts this. He says, okay, I don't mind that. If she thinks she was happy with him, then I'll take on that particular sort of punishment. But the main problem, of course, is the weakness of his drunkenness. Obviously, it is a disease, and certainly is described in that way here. One of the key phrases of the text, one often used, is when he says, "Do you understand, good sir, that what it means to have nowhere left to go?" He says, "Everywhere has to have someone to go, and do you know what it means to have nowhere left to go? No, this you have yet to understand." So the hint here is, of course, that there will be a moment within this text where Raskolnikov will have nowhere to go, but perhaps there is always somewhere to go, and that somewhere to go, of course, would be to God, okay, within the text, or to Jesus. Okay, so we can move on. I mentioned before how Sonia starts on her path of prostitution in order to help the family out. But of course, it is rather sort of cruel. It's precisely Katerina Ivanovna who's sort of said to her, well, essentially, my children, your half sisters and brothers are starving. Why don't you go out and earn us some money that way? So the actual, mental cruelty of that, to say that to Sonia, is pretty extreme here. And she says, "Do I really have to do that?" And Katerina Ivanovna mocks her. Well, why are you so special? Who are you preserving this treasure for? With this long line of suitors for you. Why is it such a big deal? So indeed, she goes out, sells her body, which, as we said before, is a crime against herself. The difference is, of course, that Raskolnikov commits a crime against someone else. Sonia commits a crime against herself here. Raskolnikov also actually commits a crime against himself. He'll later on say, "I didn't kill the old woman, I killed myself," which is an important theme in the book. But at this moment, at least, we can sense a difference, a potential difference. I mentioned before, the 30 rubles certainly isn't a realistic detail, so very much makes us think of Judas Iscariot and 30 pieces of silver for the betrayal there. So that's what the theme of betrayal suggests. Okay. Page 18, I don't know if this is mentioned in the notes of Kapernaumov, so this is a rather odd name. What does Kapernaumov refer to here? Anyone know? Capernaum? You heard of that place? That's one of the places, one of Jesus' first miracles in the New Testament. So some people call it the first miracle, but the first miracle was actually Cana of Galilee, so turning the water into wine. This is probably like the fourth miracle, but it involved a couple of things, like a demon or a man possessed by a demon going into a church, and then the demon was came out of him essentially, and that will be a big theme in Dostoevsky's Demons, not surprisingly, later on. So the suggestion here is that the world of the miraculous, the world of something completely impossible happening, is still potentially present in Petersburg life. The fact that Kapernaumov is lame and tongue-tied, and Bruder also tongue-tied as well, that maybe they could be healed, maybe some miracle could take place, essentially. Of course, the big miracle within the text is the miracle of Lazarus, which will be both a symbolic resurrection and an actual resurrection described within the text. But the fact that this detail issue, I think, is significant. On the other hand, maybe at the moment, the fact that they are suffering this way suggests the presence of the devil as well. The reason that they are suffering this way is because of demonic forces. Okay, so page 19, we see the various delusions that Katerina Ivanovna has when things start working a bit better for Marmeladov, and she'll create some amazing story about how everyone thinks of him as this great worker, and his excellency is going to promote him, and so on and so forth. We can see certain echoes of the social and rank themes that we saw in The Overcoat and elsewhere taking place. So, of course, throughout his work, Dostoevsky is building on the work of Sokol and other writers, talk about the bureaucracy and the hierarchy, the different levels of power within Russian society. Okay, so then various descriptions of what Sonia has to do to keep herself, immaculate. I didn't realize the extent to which prostitutes in Petersburg had to go and have a medical checkup every week. But they had this paperwork which was called the yellow ticket, and Sonia has this, so that it gives her the right to work as a prostitute, but also means that she has to undergo all of these medical exams as well. Page 22, Marmeladov uses this important phrase from the New Testament. You'll be forgiven for thou loved much. So the woman who loved much, essentially. So this may be seen to be again a blasphemous use of this notion, but the fact that is her having sex with lots of men equivalent to having loved much? Well, in the case of Sonia, yes, it probably is, because Sonia is possibly the most unbelievable prostitute in all of world literature for those people who are critical of her, particularly some Nabokov, when Nabokov describes the big set piece between Raskolnikov and Sonia later on in the novel. He just says it's completely implausible, and maybe there's something to that. So other critics have said that it's hard to imagine Sonia working as a prostitute. You don't really feel that she has a body. She's all idea, she's all spirit, she's all soul. Her name Sonia, Sophia, means wisdom. She is this embodiment of divine wisdom within the text. So she is all of these good things. So to actually imagine her having sex with someone as a prostitute is actually quite difficult within the text. So that's one of those places where perhaps Dostoevsky's novel is not completely convincing. Okay, so Marmeladov is pretty exhausted at this point with his big set piece about how ultimately everyone will be forgiven, all of the sinners, himself first and foremost, of course, and this apocalyptic hope that everything will be put right, thy kingdom come. So, again, we see that in the everyday seedy life of Petersburg, there is somehow this suggestion that all of world history, all of human history, leading up to the idea of the Last Judgment, the apocalypse, and so on, the whole struggle of good and evil, the whole question of salvation is playing out. So you have this double sort of perspective always in Dostoevsky. On the one hand, it's just everyday events. On the other hand, it's in the framework of eternity where big issues are being decided. Okay, so it turns out that Marmeladov's apartment is not quite as bad as he'd implied. Quite often you just have a corner of a room that you just rent out a particular corner. It turns out actually he did have his own room as well, even though it's connected there. So I don't think there's too much we need to say here. So he takes some sort of pleasure out of being humiliated by Katerina Ivanovna. He knows he deserves it. It's a sort of master-slave dialectic that Hegel would talk about. As I said, it's sadomasochistic to a certain extent as well. Raskolnikov, somewhat so strangely, despite the fact he has no money, leaves some of his money on the windowsill for them because he feels, he feels guilty. He feels he wants to help them. And of course, this is one of those little details within the text which shows the good side of Raskolnikov, and not necessarily that these small details will allow you to go on the path to salvation, but it is part of the bigger picture of who he was. The idea that he is this idealist who's somehow taken the wrong path, gone wrong. Later in Dostoevsky's work in Brothers Karamazov, there'll be a very interesting image of what's called the onion, which is just an image of one good deed you've done in your life in order to save you. So however many bad things you might have done in this particular folk tale that one of the characters talks about there, the fact that this character had done a good thing, which was, I won't go into details, but associated with an onion is actually important. So all these little things that Raskolnikov does within the text, and not so little, of course, going into a building to save some children when there's a fire taking place is actually quite a big deal as well. So it's significant. Okay. At the end of this section, third way down, page 26, a somewhat of strange statement. He says, well, what man isn't actually a scoundrel, is actually some scum, then all else is mere preconception. On the one hand, this would seem to be suggesting a positive view of mankind, but on the other hand, he's sort of saying, well, okay, it's so people are actually some decent, but at the same time, the fact that they're also decent allows me to see myself as even more decent than them, and to be a type of Superman who can do what I want to at this particular point. So it's not particularly logical as a statement there. Okay, well, we got to page 26. It's not bad going again. So next time we'll obviously deal with one other